Hello, everyone. Welcome back to your course, Learning for Arts, Aesthetics and Creativity. Our special speaker, Tom White, is here today to tell us about his exploration in art and creativity using AI. He is an artist who actually creates art with computers and AI, and I should let him to tell us more about his background. But he has done very interesting and fascinating work, and I think that he also has some new galleries about what he has created with generative arts. So please, Tom, let us know what you are up to, what you are doing.
Sure. Thank you, Ali. I really appreciate you letting me participate. I've often turned down talking invitations, but I'm an MIT alum. I really I like your research, and so I appreciated your invitation. But I also really like IAP. When I look back at MIT, that was like the IAP courses that I took were really great. And so I can tell your students that you might not remember everything you're doing at MIT, but I'm pretty sure you're going to remember some of your great IAP courses. So my background is fairly eclectic, as you might imagine. I was undergraduate in math, and I went to the media lab about 20 years ago at MIT. And I was part of a group that was doing sort of incorporating graphic design into programming. And this was sort of exploring that space. And so I'll talk a little bit in my talk about some of the precedents that we did there, but I was coming into that sort of looking at ways that people could think more about coding as a creative discipline. There's a lot of tools now that didn't exist in it. There's even the idea of creative coding, and a lot of that kind of came out of the work that we did in our group. After leaving MIT, I sort of went off into industry for many years. I was always interested in AI and art and the sort of intersection of those, but it was kind of the AI winner, and it was, I got out of school and went into industry. But when deep learning started getting exciting, maybe about 5 to 10 years ago, that's when I revectored back into the space. And so I found myself going back in academia. And now I wear multiple hats. So I have my own research students here, and I'll speak a little bit in my talk about some of the research we do. So there's, like Rebecca was saying, there's a number of practical tools you can build that will help other people use the medium creatively. And I do some of that research. But as you alluded to on the side, I also have my own separate arts practice. And most of my talk is going to be about that. And hopefully that'll be a good I think everyone's art practice is different, but I think seeing that might be hopefully inspirational for some students that are wondering like what that's about or how they might one day get into something like that.
Yeah, definitely. That would be actually very great. I think that maybe, I think you and also work of the work that Rebecca did also give us some taste about what it really means from the art practitioners as well as the computer scientists. So please go ahead.
Okay, I will try to share my slides and we'll get started. Okay, so I will briefly just reintroduce myself for the video. So my name is Tom White. You can find me online on my handle Tribnet, and there's my website trib.net. And as I said, I'm an artist and lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington School of Design. And in my work here, I teach classes on creative coding. So I teach primarily in the context of an art and design school to students that are interested in, it might be that they're interested in special effects or that they're interested in web design, but they want to sort of incorporate programming into their tool set because there's a lot of capabilities and things that unlocked. So in the past, where someone might, learn charcoal drawing or sort of specific techniques, more and more today, students want to learn programming. So I teach programming, but not from a computer science angle, but from a kind of creative coding angle. I also have research, which I do with my graduate students, and I'll touch upon that briefly in the talk as well, where we make creative tools using some of these technologies. And in that context, I also I have a workshop at the NeurIPS conference, Creativity and Design, that I do with other co-hosts, where we host a lot of this research. But what my talk today is about a lot of my artwork, and specifically the artwork that I've been doing the last 3 to 5 years. And I'm going to sort of go through and give you a background of myself, and then talk about that a little bit. Let's see if I can get my first slide going. There we go. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to give basically a 3-minute version of the talk, the TLDR, like what's the point of this talk, so you can sort of understand it all at once, what this is. Then I'm going to back up and give you a little bit more background about where I'm coming from, my background at MIT, and since then. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the precedents in art. So when you're doing artwork, similar to, if you're writing a research paper, you have your references at the end, and that contextualizes and talks about how you're building on things in the past. I think it's important in art. I think a lot of times it's implicit, but here I'm going to make it a little bit more explicit about what my precedents are and what I find inspirational, and what I'm trying to, what I'm using as reference points. Then I'm going to get into the meat of the talk. So the meat of the talk is really, or the core of my talk here is about AI representation and abstraction, and specifically my investigations into kind of exploring what these neural net vision systems, what their representations are, and how to convey that in an artistic context. I will talk a little bit about other AI art approaches, including other peers that I have that are in this space. And I'll touch a little bit about on my research there, and then I'll close out by talking about the sort of the implications of the artwork. So what happens when these systems, when we're using these systems more and more as our kind of auxiliary eyes. So that's the outline of the talk. This is the core of it. So this is the sort of the summary that my ideas in my artwork is that machines have their own way of seeing. So they see things. They're very accurate in classifiers, but I think they also importantly have slightly different ways of seeing the world. And so what I'm trying to do in my artwork is trying to expose that to a wider audience, and trying to investigate how it is that these machines see the world and how it might be the same or different as us. So as a sort of a corollary of that, because they see things differently, I believe we can create art that's kind of for and by machines. In other words, you could use the machine perception to create different types of art, which actually the machines themselves have some opinions about. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And so the summary there is that through art, we can actually appreciate ways that machines can perceive the world. So similar to how you might encounter a new culture that you hadn't before, and you might explore the art of that culture. I'm trying to explore the art that's created when we introduce machine perception into the process. So the one-line version of that is I'm interested in how machines read images. So that's kind of the point of what I'm doing. Here's 3 prints that I've done. The one on the left is an eye, and that was created from a data set of eyes, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. The one all the way on the right is, it's actually a face, and that was made not so much for a classifier, but for a facial recognition system. The first step in facial recognition is a detector, and so that was made to look like a face, to a face detection system. And the one in the center here, which I'll make a little bit bigger, is a screen print of 2 chickens. And so this is, all of these are based on pure images, and I'll get, as you can imagine, more into the details of how this happens as I go through the paper or go through the talk. But this is based on a data set of many actual images of chickens. The system created this output. And we can actually turn it around, and we can show this to the system again and look at its imagination of what it visualizes, and we get kind of this. So we can actually introduce diagnostics into the process and say, well, what is it that the computer sees when they look at this print? And that gives us some kind of indication of the richer inner world of these neural networks. So that is my, I guess, 3-minute version of the whole talk. And now we're going to sort of back up and go through that in a little bit more detail. And I'll start off talking a little bit more about myself. So this is made at my studio currently, where I do my printing. And I'm here in Wellington, New Zealand, but I'm going to go back and talk about not everything I've done, but maybe some important precedents along the way for getting to sort of this stage of my art making. 25 years ago at SIGGRAPH, I did sort of using machine learning techniques of the time, artificial evolution, to make these real-time video filters that processed video and then showed that on a screen. And you could also manipulate the evolution process to create different filters. In 1998, I finished my master's thesis at MIT. And so, like I said, I was in a group at MIT, John Maeda's Aesthetics and Computation group. I was there with many kind of inspired people that were coming in from both design and computer programming, software engineering. And I was interested at the time on better computer-human interfaces. So I built a custom hand interface because I was interested in multi-touch. So multi-touch wasn't really a big idea in the 90s. So there wasn't any interfaces that did that. So I built a camera optics-based interface. So it's this liquid pad. And when you pushed on it, you would get this handprint that you see in the bottom right. And then on top of that, I built various interfaces. For example, sliding left to right to move something, or there's various different ways you could interact based on having more than a mouse. So I think this is common sort of ideas now, but this was something that we did in the Media Lab and I did for my thesis. But maybe one of the other things at this time, as I did another art project, which is still pretty well known, which is called Stream of Consciousness, in which I incorporated this hand pad, which could measure sort of pressure across a whole pad, into this interactive exhibit where words were flowing through a stream, and it was called Stream of Consciousness. One sort of interesting footnote about this is that as the words were going through, you could push on a word and it would spring out related words. So if you were looking at the word, university, and you pushed on it, it might say faculty or school or academia or something like that. And we used WordNet at the time. That was part of the programming idea, to kind of find out interesting related words, both antonyms and synonyms, and kind of its syn set that it uses, which is the basis for ImageNet, which is a lot of the artwork I do today. So this was kind of again, using AI techniques at the time, incorporating it in these interactive exhibitions. But one of the interesting legacies, and I think another bit that feeds into my current practice, is that one of the interesting legacies of this group is that we made a lot of interesting sort of core software that enabled a lot of people to do different things. So there was a handful of researchers, and I and Ben Fry and Jared Schiffman were students in the group, and we were responsible for creating and maintaining this core library called ACU. And the library was so that basically we could conduct our experiments, and it was constructed such that it was easy to do kind of a software sketch. And the reason I bring this up is that this software was the basis for other systems that have come since. So Ben, who worked on this, and Casey later adapted some of these ideas and made a version of this called Processing, which is actually quite popular still as a creative toolkit. And then later, another group of students took actually the code for this and made a new toolkit called OpenFrameworks, which uses some of the code in this ends up in OpenFrameworks. And then they, of course, built upon it and built a community around it. But many of the conventions and cliches of this programming style kind of live on today. And this is, it's interesting as it alludes to my current work, because what we were doing at the time, we were just trying to figure out how to make it easy for people to create sketches or drawings on the computer. And I feel that that's a lot of what I'm doing currently. It's just my audience is no longer other people, it's actually machine learning processes. And then I did other things and worked in industry, but for the purpose of this talk, we'll just, chalk that off to the AI winner, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. So there's, after that I graduated from school, I did some other things.
I'm going to also open the chat over here in case other people had feedback that I can secretly see. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about precedents in art and some of the background, looking at it from a slightly different angle of what it is I'm trying to do. I'm going to go all the way back to 1927, and there's an artist called Stuart Davis that I admired his technique and what he was doing, or what he did for kind of his central, a core inspiration for his work is that there was one year that he did the Egg Beater series, and the Egg Beater series was his attempt to look at the world in a new way. And the way he did that, his technique for that was he took some common everyday objects. He took an electric fan, a rubber glove, and an egg beater, and he nailed those to a tabletop and basically forced himself to paint those things over and over and over until he thought he was doing something different and new. In his own words, what he said his intent was in doing this was to strip a subject down to the real physical source of its stimulus. So here's one of his egg beater works where he's taking these common objects and trying to find something new in them. And I think that that's some of that alludes to sort of some of the work that I'm doing, and I'll sort of touch on that in a little bit. Another precedent for me was Harold Cohen, who for many years experimented with generative drawing systems and is arguably the first kind of AI artist. He came at this from a different angle. He was a very successful visual artist and painter, and he decided in the early 70s that he wanted to go into programming, into artificial intelligence, to see if he could codify some of his ideas on mark making in a formal way. So here's an example of one of his programs, and he initially set out to build an autonomous program, and he called the program Aaron, and Aaron would kind of encompass all the ideas he had about how to generate visual works. So I visited Harold a couple of times, and this is me visiting him and when he's working on some of his later works. And I think it's also interesting to discuss, like, even though he had these ideas that the artworks were being created autonomously initially, later in life he was working more as a collaborator with these systems. So he was sort of working a little bit or finding ways where it was more of a co-creation process. But across all of his different phases, his core question across this, and this is what I kind of share as inspiration, is his question was, what is an image? And the way he didn't mean that like technically what is an image, but he meant like what is the minimum condition under which a set of marks on a page functions as an image or conveys meaningful information. This is a sketch he had from one of his papers, and I would kind of rephrase this in a machine learning context as saying, what is it that images can do kind of central to representation and abstraction? Like, what makes simplification work? How is it that simple drawings can be evocative and seem to stand for something else? So I think that this is kind of a core concern of Harold's that I also share. And then one last kind of precedent in art that I think is important for me is just talking a little bit about pop artists. This is not so much as from the content side, but from the form side. This is actually, I share some techniques with many of the pop artists like Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, in how I execute my artwork. So for anyone that's not familiar with screen printing, if I'm making this chicken image over here on the right, that's actually printed, but it's printed from 2 layers of ink. And so these are essentially stencils that I have to mix inks for and then put onto the page. So what I'm showing on the left are the masks that generate the stencils to give you the image on the right. So the stencils themselves get transferred onto screens. These are physical kind of stencil. It's like a stencil, except it can have holes on it. There's a mesh there. And then you just sort of pour ink across this screen, and you smash some ink through it. And that's the kind of physical process of making these prints. Here's a little slideshow I have where I'm starting off with a blank canvas. It's actually not blank. We base coated a color onto it. We put a screen down. I put some ink on top of it. I spread the ink out. That's called the flood. Then you smash the ink through and you get a layer. And then the more colors you want, the more layers you have to do that. So for the second color, you have to do another screen and another layer. For the third color, it's another screen. That's me pushing the ink through that layer. And then there's a fourth color there. Put the ink on the screen, spread it out, and push it through. So just kind of emphasizing that there's a kind of a specific technique I'm using that has, you know, precedent for getting, these are acrylic on canvas works or acrylic on paper, but it's, instead of a brush technique, it's a screen printing technique. And here's the result of some of that. So this is kind of just showing you what happens at the end, is that I have these prints and the prints end up kind of, you know, in an exhibition or in some type of art context. So that's kind of the precedents, the art precedents. I think it's useful kind of now to talk about more what this artwork is and what it is I'm trying to say with my art pieces. So I'm going to get into the sort of the main section here, which is the AI representation and abstraction. Like, how is it I actually create these works, and what is it that they stand for? So just going back to revisiting Stuart Davis. So in my mind, Stuart Davis spent a year basically learning how to perceive and represent familiar objects in new ways. So he, you know, imagine going in every day and staring at these same 3 or 4 objects, a rubber glove and an electric fan, until finally you're seeing them in ways you hadn't before, and then you're trying to put that on the page. And my kind of core question is can we similarly use computer vision to introduce new ways of perceiving and representing familiar objects? So instead of going to this meditative trance, can we kind of look at things through the eyes of the computer vision systems and see if that causes us to see familiar things in new ways? So appropriately enough, one of my first experiments in this was an electric fan. So this is an electric fan training set. So this is the input into the system, where you have computer vision systems, as you probably know, need hundreds of thousands of images. So I believe in the ImageNet electric fan data, there is over 1,000 images of an electric fan, and this is just quickly paging through some of those. And then what I did with that is I made a system that optimized perceptually for creating something that looked like an electric fan to multiple trained neural networks. And so here I'm showing the print that I made of an electric fan. It was created using a similar technique done in layers. And this is on the right side, these are, or in the middle, I guess, is the graph showing what the opinions of this print are when shown to different networks like Inception or ResNet or VGG, and they all are very confident that they're looking at an electric fan. So this is using techniques also from like adversarial examples. So that's some, these are computer security techniques where you try to essentially fool a computer into thinking it's seeing something. But in my instance, I'm not tricking it. I'm actually just trying to make a super stimulus, or a stimulus that is most evocative of that category that it knows. And so this is an example of me trying to see how these computer AI algorithms perceive these common objects. Here's an example of the drawing system sort of in progress. As you can imagine, it's an optimization. It starts off kind of putting lines on the page where it thinks they're most needed, and then it kind of anneals or optimizes over that and makes the image look more and more like the target class that it's trying to make. And one way that I contextualize this or talk about this in my writing is that for me, it kind of inverts the computer as a tool stereotype. So for many, many years, we've seen the computer as kind of a way to execute someone's vision. So you sit down and you use Photoshop and you have an idea and you kind of do it. You use the tool to express your idea. What I'm trying to do here is I'm kind of inverting that. And I've made a tool that the computer vision systems themselves can use to create their own visual outputs. So I'm sort of making the tool for the perception systems. So after I finished some of those, I did a series of 10 of these, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them, to talk about how they're made, but also what machine learning concepts are kind of bubbling through. So this is a print called Binoculars. again, using this sort of same two-layer technique. This is the data set on the right, and then this is the print on the left. One interesting thing I thought about the way this print turned out is that it's viewing the binoculars in 3/4 view, which is kind of an interesting angle because you can see all of the features pretty easily from kind of not, instead of a straight on view as much of the data is. This is a shark, specifically a hammerhead shark, which is one of the categories of the ImageNet. And here it's done a very few number of strokes to kind of try to represent the essence of the shark outlines. In fact, we can kind of count the strokes. I believe it's about 14 or so. So this is a little animation which is showing the strokes one by one, just so you can see the number of primitives. So from a programming point of view, you might think of this as the number of parameters in the space, but this is also kind of defining the complexity of the image that it's able to produce. After the shark, I did a different one, which is iron. Again, kind of an interesting view it took. It did this kind of perpendicular view, which is where you might get the most characteristic view of the iron. The iron uses the same number of strokes as the shark does. So one fun thing we can do is we can actually start with the shark, and then we can move the strokes around so that they create the iron. And I did this in software, and then at each step, at the end steps, I show this to the networks to see what they're thinking, what they believe they're looking at. And on one side here, you can see the 6 networks are very convinced they're looking at an iron, and then we move the strokes around, and they're similarly convinced they're looking at a hammerhead shark. I did this a couple of years ago as a demo. There's a lot of debate in the deep learning community how these models work, and there's a group of people that actually were proposing that deep learning was mainly triggering on textures and didn't have any global structure information. So I think this is a pretty compelling counterexample that says, well, no, these deep learning systems might preference structure or texture or might use texture, but they do seem to have some global structure information in their vision systems. Just a couple more of these. This is a cello, or I should say this is the label cello, which, as you can imagine, has not only cellos, but cellists and other things in the photos that are used for classification. And it's interesting to try to, now I don't have any special insight into the drawing that is produced by the system. So I don't know, people ask me, what is it representing? And I don't know particularly, but I can go into the data and poke around and take my best guess. So to me, this cello image looks like these kind of characteristic photos in the data. So you might call this a mode of the data, or about 25% of the data has this general shape where you have a cellist behind the cello playing. And I'll point out a couple of things that I think I see that resemble these training examples. And I'll point out one thing that's very different. So you might try to figure out in the 30 seconds that it takes me to get there, whether you can find the thing that's different in those. But the things that are the same is I see this like light colored object kind of looming behind this darker one. I see that maybe fingers curled around a fretboard, which was kind of surprising to me. But the one thing that's very different about the image that it drew and all the cellists that I saw in the data set is all the cellists in the data set are right-handed, and all these that I just kind of pulled out randomly are, but improbably the cellist it decided to draw was left-handed. And that's relevant because I'm interested in how these computer vision systems see, and they're actually, because of the way they're trained, they're blind to left-right symmetries. So because of image augmentation to buffer the data sets, they cannot see, or they're not aware of any features that are dependent on left-right symmetries. And so it chose to kind of invert this one and draw a left-handed cellist, which I thought was interesting. And then there's 2 more. So this is one that's measuring cup. Not too surprising here, seeing the other ones where it's drawn a measuring cup that you might see in your kitchen. The thing that I haven't so in addition to choosing the shapes for these drawings, it's also choosing the colors. And I thought it was really strange that it chose this bright green color, because I've never seen a green measuring cup. So again, I dove into the data and I found that the data set actually had a large number of examples where there were green measuring cups. And I dug into this a little bit more, and it turns out that there's this collectible measuring cup called depression glass measuring cups. This was made around World War I, and for whatever reason, people were putting uranium in the glass, and these were collectible. And so there's a lot of these post-it alum where people are trading them because they're collectible. And this is an example of sampling bias. So arguably this measuring cup is not very commonly green, but because of the way this data is kind of farmed off of the web, there's a lot of green ones that end up in the training set. So to this computer vision system, it's actually quite likely that there would be a green measuring cup. So this is, again, kind of showing how the machine learning techniques are bubbling through in the results. And then the last one I'll show here is tick. So tick is one of my least popular, at least by sales, prints that I've done. No one wants to put a tick in their home, I guess, on the wall. But this one I'm pointing out because in addition to sort of the print itself, it actually had a really strong response across many networks. And so I decided to quantify that. And the gold standard on this is to take the validation set of the data set itself. And so I took the validation set for ImageNet, and I took a network that wasn't involved in the creation of this. It was Inception ResNet. And I scored all of the validation examples, and these fell into two classes, basically things that were ticks and things that weren't ticks. But the short of it is that this image of a tick registers stronger than all of the validation examples, which is fairly surprising. Like the tick response here is kind of, like I said, a super stimulus or a stronger example of a tick to these networks than even pictures of the tick from the validation set. But this has precedent in art and design as well. Scott McCloud in his series, in his book, Understanding Comics, talks about amplification through simplification and how if you're trying to represent, say, a man, then you're maybe not well served by using a particular photo of a particular man because that doesn't well fit the concept. It's too specific to one particular person. And actually by abstracting and removing some details, you can come up with a drawing or a sketch that better represents a man or a person or different levels of abstraction in concepts. And so arguably, I think that might be what we're seeing here, where we're taking a real tick and we're removing some features and leaving the most salient ones. This is also, just as a footnote, kind of how symbolic abstraction and writing started. So Sumerian writing start if you owe someone 3 oxes, you write a picture of 3 oxes in your clay tablet, and over time that evolves into kind of symbolic abstractions. So that was my series, Perception Engines, which is Tim Prints. I'm going to talk briefly about some other series that I've done since then. There's one that I did after that called Synthetic Abstractions. I've covered it here because as a warning, this is technically not safe for work imagery. So if you are uncomfortable looking at images that at least vision systems say are explicit imagery, I encourage you to pause your video or look away now. So here we go. These are abstract prints that I made, specifically looking at not so much systems for ImageNet, but these systems that impact us all online. So, we have Google Safe Search, and we have these other systems that try to shield us from certain images. And I'm wondering, like, well, are there abstract versions of what it is that seems to trigger these filters? So as an example of one of these, I made this print Mustard Dream. It's on mustard colored paper, and it's just black and white ink. And when you show a print, a picture of this print to computer vision systems like Google Safe Search, it'll register as adult or racy. Similarly, Amazon thinks it's explicit nudity, and Yahoo thinks it's not safe for work. So here I am exhibiting that print. I did a series of these. There was another one, Pitch Stream, another one, composition with red, blue, and yellow. That's kind of an art joke here because it's a riff on a well-known other work, except my arrangement of inks triggers these algorithms, these filter algorithms. I have done some similar canvas-baked works more recently in this vein. So these are 2 newer ones where I'm actually trying to, I don't know what it is in the other one. So people ask me, well, what is it the computer sees? And I don't know. Like I said, I don't have any kind of knowledge, and maybe I wouldn't want to know. We don't have interpretable ML where we can ask the system what it sees. Here, I'm actually trying to steer the data set a little bit more by influencing it influence the result by a data set. And so this is, for example, one of those. I actually called this one Illustrated Nude, which I'll talk a little bit later about why I changed the title of it. But that's because, you know, when you show this to Amazon, that's what it classifies it at. It says, you know, it thinks it's looking at an illustrated nude and it's fairly high confidence. And similarly, Google Safe Search again thinks it's a racy or adult image. So if you were searching for this, you in Safe Search, you wouldn't see it. And if you got an email, it might go in your spam folder, for example. Okay, so I'm going to talk, I'm just going to go a few more examples just to kind of get a gist of how so after that, I made sure my systems were working kind of in the large with these online APIs. So this is a data set for killer whale, a painting of the killer whale, and then the responses from Google's online vision API. So you can see it thinks it's a killer whale or a marine mammal. Part of the interest here is also what the ontology or the labels for these different systems are. Similarly, here's a penguin. So we're looking at the data set on the left, thousands of images of penguins, the version of a penguin that ended up being printed. And then you can see the Google API sees this as a penguin or a flightless bird, or even particular types of penguins like emperor penguin. As I mentioned before, there's the ability to do custom data sets. And so as a commission collaboration I did with Yacht for their album artwork, I did a series of custom data sets. This is one from that series where we had a data set of eyes and we trained the system to make a synthetic eye. And as you can see, when Google looks at this, it thinks it's seeing a face or a nose or eyebrow or eyelash. So there's sort of eye features coming through in the labels. And this is another one I did similarly where it's pictures of rabbits. So this one is a very kind of simple rendition of a rabbit. And again, it's kind of funny what the Google labels for this end up being. Evidently, they have separate labels for hare, rabbit and hares, and domestic rabbit. And it kind of triggers all of those different labels in its API response. More recently, and this is kind of getting up to what I've been doing the last year, I've been exhibiting these in groups. I found that instead of showing one example, it actually is more enlightening to see many of these at once, because you can kind of get a feel for what the visual language or the common elements are. So these are 6 chickens and 6 eyes, which I exhibited about this time last year at SIGGRAPH Gallery. This is something I did subsequently where I took that kind of even a step further, and there's kind of this room full of images the computer thinks are knots. And so we have different shape and color combinations, all being different images that the computer thinks are reminding it of. And I think knots is kind of an interesting one because it's kind of this amorphous shape, but there seems to be some commonality visually to what the computer thinks is a knot. And then this is one I have that's in progress. Maybe I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about what these might be. But these are actually, this looks like it might be computer images, but these are actually photos of canvases, which I've taken where I'm starting to organize these into groups. And these are all the canvases that have just been completed. And this is for an upcoming exhibition on ants. And so all of these are shapes that will trigger in computer vision systems to different extents, thinking that it's looking at an ant. So that's kind of a summary of my work. I'm going to spend the remainder of my talk talking about other approaches and a little bit about and a little bit about my research, and then I'll just briefly talk about how my artwork impacts the real world or effects it has once it gets out into the world. So as a lot of the other speakers have mentioned is these generative techniques, and I think these are very relevant and they're used on other AI approaches, but there's also this idea that other AI art approaches had different narratives. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So when I came into, when I started getting interested in modern deep learning, I actually got into generative networks as well. And for a while, I was doing a lot of important research on this, or research that I enjoyed digging into how these things works in 2015 and 2016. This is an artwork I did in 2016. It was just large, like 2 meter by 1 meter print. Here's a zoom in showing this, and this was images of faces. So at the time, these were really high quality neural net outputs for faces, before we had StyleGAN and these other more modern networks. And I was interested in kind of the space of faces that could be created. And I wrote a paper talking about some of these techniques and how you could sample these networks to get kind of the best outputs from those. I also, since subsequent to that, have continued looking at these generative networks in more of a research sense. So in my research capacity at the university, I work, for example, in this system with my graduate student. As Rebecca alluded to, there's an interesting kind of getting these out to tools to other creators. And so one of the ideas I have with this graduate student was to make a spreadsheet tool where instead of numbers in a spreadsheet, you actually had samples from a generative model. And could you use this as a way of giving people sort of their own creativity tool through the interface of a spreadsheet. So it's looking at some of these generative models. But in the context of this art talk, I mainly just wanted to say this is a tool other people are using. So Helena Sarin is using these, Mario Klingemann. Helena is using these in a way that, again, Rebecca alluded to, where she's using these small data sets and essentially overfitting those data sets and changing the data set to get the result that she's looking for. Mario Klingemann in this project, Neural Glitch, was training one of these, and then he intentionally kind of damages the network and then displays how that damage comes through visually in his artwork. So it's the idea that there's a sort of an intentional glitch in there. There's two other artists that I'll mention one is Robbie Barrett, who did this project a few years ago called Art DC GAN, where he looked at using these generative networks to specifically create portraits. And there's another well-known, at least in AI art, precedent, which is Obvious's Edmund de Bellamy. It's well-known mainly because it went up for auction for a very high amount of money at Sotheby's a couple of years ago. These actually, I'm putting up mainly because they use very, very similar techniques. In fact, they share some code and techniques across them, but they have very different narratives behind them. And so I wanted to kind of point out, and the narrative here is, like what the story is behind how these are made. So when Robbie is and when I'm, showing my work, it's very much talking about using these things as a tool or as a collaboration. But there is a strong push, or there's a lot of people in the AR community that more say that, no, it's the computer is autonomous and it's making these artworks. And that was the kind of stance that Obvious took. And it's one that resonates with people. I think taken to an extreme, what you get is you get a lot of people making work with robots. So it's common for people to make these robot artists. And here's just one example of that. But these have a long history. So there's actually a long history of making these drawing automatons. And here's one, that's 200 years old, where it's basically being driven by gears. And so I just mentioned this is that I see this as a slippery slope. And so I kind of stay away from this and intentionally don't use any, at least for now, kind of drawing automaton, because I want to contextualize what I'm doing as a collaboration between what I'm doing. So going back kind of again to Harold Cohen and his work, and most of the AI artists in the space, this is what I'm doing is not so much me handing over full autonomy and saying the computer is the artist, but coming up with a co-creation process where there's a role for me and there's a role for these systems that I'm making. Okay, and in the last 5 minutes here, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when we put these things out in the wild and how these are some of my artwork, how it's kind of how we can understand it. So of course, we can ask the machine what it sees. We can use visualization techniques, but the one I'm highlighting most here is these unintended consequences, like what surprises has happened. And keep in mind that from the eyes of the computer perception system, this is Magritte's Treachery of Images, where he was kind of pointing out like a picture of a pipe is not a pipe, but that distinction often is lost with these perception systems. Like if they see something, a representation of something, they more or less think it's that thing. So the first way you could tell or interpret or think about my artwork is you can ask a system what it sees. So if I take this picture I took of me with my artwork 6 chickens and I feed it to the Amazon API, it will come back and show very diligently that it found a chicken and a bird and et cetera. And there's a person over on the side. And I think that's one way to kind of understand how these systems are viewing or understanding these artworks, so the systems themselves. There was another way that I talked about in the beginning where you can actually use visualization techniques. So this is using some research from OpenAI where they have visualization techniques similar to Deep Dream, where they I can take one of my prints and feed it to one of these systems and ask it to kind of imagine how it relates. So here's the print, 2 chickens. Here's kind of the inner imagination or visualization of what the computer sees when it sees that. And you can even take that a little bit further and try to visualize that in 3D. So this is a little slideshow where it attempts to add some fake depth to that image so that it can kind of understand it. But I think what's most interesting is how these things kind of accidentally kind of bump into real world systems. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those to close out. So this is an exhibition I talked about in 2018. I had these prints that were supposed to trigger various safe search filters. And this is an exhibition. On the left, I have this not so great photo of it with a lot of glare and stuff. And I actually took a picture of this and was going to post it to Tumblr, and it didn't allow me to post it to Tumblr. The actual post failed, and it said, this post contains adult content, which violates our community guidelines. It was flagged as adult content, and it was not displayed. So I think that's one example of it kind of bumping up against these real world systems. Similarly, I had another work in that series. The Architectural Digest wanted to put a print in one of their magazines. I showed them some prints, and they wanted the most colorful one, which was Lime Dream. Again, maybe not the most appropriate because it's supposed to be explicit imagery, but they decided to go with it anyway. And so when I got a copy of the magazine, I took a not so great picture of the magazine and I fit into the Amazon API, and it was still convinced it was looking at explicit nudity. So I think this might be the first example of a cybernetic centerfold, like basically a photo of a nude made for these kind of vision systems that has appeared in a magazine. Similarly, like the art gets sold in weird ways. And so I had a print at a gallery, and they sold off, without my knowledge, one of these prints to Sloan Kettering. So if you go to their academic offices in New York, you can actually see one of these prints. Again, I don't know that it might be the most appropriate for this environment. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I alluded to earlier. I gave these initially kind of these vague names, but now I've called them illustrated nudes explicitly because I want, if someone buys or sees one of these, I want them to know what it's supposed to represent. And so the only way for me to package that is to put it in the title where it can't be missed. I did a print a couple of years ago that I took to NeurIPS. I was stretching it in my hotel room and hanging it up. And when I went to take a picture of it, I was very happy. This is my camera interface when this little yellow rectangle appeared. So I think if anyone has a phone, they know this is when your camera is trying to focus on a face. And so just the fact that this was a shape intended to trigger a face in machine learning algorithms kind of pulled the focus onto this because it thought there was a face in the scene. And then the last one of these is just getting ready for this talk. So as you can imagine, getting ready for this talk, I'm trying to find images of my artwork, and I'm pulling them on my phone. And lo and behold, when I pull up my phone, down at the bottom, it says, well, you have several people and places and categories of things. And here's the categories of things that I've kind of partitioned for you that you might be interested in, like your animals and your food. So of course, these aren't real animals and food. If I search for banana, it thinks it's, you know, I've done a print of banana, and when I'm working on the print, I take a lot of pictures of it. And so these have gotten classified as bananas or scorpions. This is a sombrero, a print I was working on, but it's funny too, because it kind of mixes the real, this is a picture of mine, a friend in a funny hat, and it ends up putting that in the picture with the artwork. Again, like I'm saying, the computer doesn't have a concept of what a lot of times is a representation of something versus what is the real thing. So if I do a search for syringe, not only do I get this weird photo that I took, and I don't remember why, of a real syringe, but probably I get this like really wacky hypercolor syringe print that I was working on a few years ago. So I think it's interesting how these kind of get collapsed in these vision systems as being kind of the same thing. So that's it. Those just to recap, the core ideas of my artwork is that the machines have their own way of seeing. We can create art for and by machines, which is what I'm trying to do, is trying to use the capabilities of machines and understand art through their eyes. and through art, we, and by we I mean like people knowledgeable about deep learning, but also people who might not have any background in machine learning, can appreciate the ways that machines perceive the world. So thanks. That's my online handle for Twitter and my webpage. I'm open for taking questions, and I will also say for questions that I'm very open for things that were part of the talk, but also might have been things only loosely alluded to in the talk. If you had questions on, you know, more about research tools or the community, or things like that, I'm happy to take any sort of a broad range of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. It was so great. So I was wondering if students have questions.
This is from very early on in the talk, but I'm wondering why you chose screen printing as your medium of choice.
Great question. Sorry, I had to take a sip of water there. So yeah, so I wanted to actually make physical work, and I thought that was, you know, it's actually easier for me to make work that is on the computer, but it takes it kind of a step further to create something that's printed, and that's also, so I think there's two parts to the question. Why make physical work at all? And then if you're making physical work, why have it be screen printed? So I think that two reasons for making physical work. One is I think that people relate to physical work differently and when they go into a gallery or an art setting. So for years I did these interactive installations with screens and things, and I think that people come into those a little bit on the defensive because sort of it's technology right away. Like you go in and you see the screen and you see, you know, this camera looking at you or something, and I think it sets a tone for how this is, for what's to be expected. And so I really wanted to do a physical print that sort of was more about the was more about how the computer sees it than about the sort of putting the process in the gallery. But the purpose for doing the screen print is I wanted something that was very exact. So I actually have done some prints that weren't part of the talk where I've experimented with other techniques, brush techniques. And so it's not really critical to use screen printing, but screen printing allows me to, with some level of very precision, like make a traditional artwork. So, and it has precedent kind of in the art world through these pop artists. So I felt it was kind of a good middle ground for kind of executing these. I could, of course, print them out on a printer or something else, but I think that I wanted to kind of constrain my way, you might think, in the same ways that artists in the past had constrained themselves. So it makes it more easy to compare my works with existing artists if I'm kind of operating with the same constraints or under the same interface, you might think of it. One thing I'll say too about making physical work is it makes it much more difficult to pull off these techniques, these kind of adversarial techniques, because I don't know what the lighting or the angle of the photo is. So I have to make these results work for a distribution of possible photos that might be taken. So if that's a part of, you know, if you look at adversarial images research, there's kind of doing it on the computer and there's doing it in the physical world. And it's always kind of more difficult challenge to take these to the physical world, but that's kind of where I was interested in taking this.
Cool, thank you so much.
Excellent. Are there other questions? I think that this is very interesting how thinking in art and, you know, having this dual view of computers and arts can inspire such an interesting work. For instance, we see that, you know, as you said, one of the applications of this could be really adversarial attack and, you know, cybersecurity, which is really hard to think about it if we only want to think about security and exclude this type of artistic practices. I never thought about it in this way, like how art can help for better understanding of, for instance, data bias or algorithmic bias or other aspects of AI. So I thought that was very interesting.
Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah, that actually came through in my original generative work. So when I was working with generative networks, I found that they were actually really good at visualizing bias. So if you go back in my paper, I talk a little bit about how the Celeb A data set has a label for smiling. But in that data set, and I talk about ways that you can build dialers where you can turn up the smiling and down the smiling by using the labels on the data set. But there's bias in the data set where women are much more likely than men to be smiling, just as a product of how the data was collected, like almost twice as likely. It's like 1.5 or something like that. And so as you build these tools that are intended, or as you tell the network that you want to make an image smile more, you're actually also changing some of the masculine, feminine characteristics of the image. And I thought it was a very visceral way to kind of see some of the machine learning bias. So that can come through in these generative networks. But yeah, I think it also comes through in the visualization of these. And I'm kind of careful not to couch my work too much in adversarial examples, because I think that I certainly use some of their techniques, but where I depart from them is they're always trying to do something imperceptible or something that is, well, it's adversarial. Like in the name, they're trying to trick the system, whereas I'm more using it as a visualization, or kind of getting under the hood and kind of understanding what the stimuluses are that might trigger these in the first place.
Yeah, also it is very interesting how, doing by minimal strokes, you could achieve these things. And this is another way of thinking of compression, for instance, which was, as you said, inspired from art and artwork.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, and I think that, so there's a very practical reason to do that too, is because I'm not using any really advanced techniques for generating these. I'm basically doing like random search or genetic algorithm. So it's basically doing a search over the space of outputs, and it just moves, it does a search estimating the gradient. And so the fewer parameters you have, the easier job you're going to have sort of hill climbing in that aspect. So it benefits me to have a simple representation for this. And there's other things about my drawing style. When I talk about making a drawing system for these, like I can't have too many discontinuities and things like that in the drawing styles that I have. But yeah, I think it's also very interesting to come up with these kind of tight, like for the shark, it's 12 strokes to kind of represent a shape that when shown to the system still seems to be a strong stimulus for that category.
Yeah, that also reminds me of the work that scientists did in computer vision, for instance, the work of Antonio Traubel, where the question is, how many pixels do you need, the minimum number of pixels to show to a computer, for instance, and in terms of images, to see what is this object, or get a gist of this object. For instance, they experimented a set of only 32 pixels, and they found that you can get a gist of what is going on in this, for instance, image with computer vision techniques. So that is also very interesting.
Yeah, it's also similar to, I don't remember the researchers that did the psychology research, where they take face images and they put them in very low, like they basically make icons where they're, like 8 by 8 pixels or 16 by 16 pixels, and you could still recognize Abraham Lincoln or these famous figures in these very low resolution formats. So I think people also have this ability to decipher these very low information images as well.
Yeah, very interesting. Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. It was great and really inspiring work, and I appreciate that.
Thanks so much for having me. And if anyone else has any questions, I'm happy to, if you send me an email and follow up from the class. I know not everyone likes asking questions in this class, but I'm happy to follow up on, every artist is a little bit different. And so there's no common template I think you can follow, but hopefully this will be this is one good example of a path that someone else might be interested in taking.
Certainly. And then also Tom has been involved with the workshop of machine learning for art and creativity at NeurIPS for several years. So that's also an interesting and valuable contribution that he is making. So if any questions.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. So I do know a lot of that research and can direct you to those. And I would encourage you, if you are interested in the space, you can, I believe, still access a lot of the videos, for example, from this past year's workshop, just to get an overview of going a little bit deeper into some of these talks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one. Thanks, everybody.